Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
What's up, guys? It's Darren. So how many of you have actually considered getting your MBAs abroad in a different country than, where you were raised and where you work? I thought this episode was really interesting because Brandon Kirby, who is the Director of Marketing and Admissions for the Rotterdam School of Management, which is based in Rotterdam, Netherlands, was an American, basically entrepreneur who, after finishing his own MBA, ended up working at Rotterdam in the Netherlands with his family. And I think that not only will you get a much better idea of what the RSM MBA is all about, I think Brandon was very candid during this interview, which I really appreciate. And those of you interested in the program will really get a good idea of the cultural fit qualities he's looking for and what to expect at this one-year MBA. But I also think it's really interesting to hear Brandon talk about business education in the Netherlands and what he's trying to do there with his team, and why it might be an interesting choice for you to consider. And that's what we're trying to do on this podcast, is also showcase top-ranked schools outside the ones you already know. Anyways, I hope you enjoy this conversation, get some good insight from it, get some good application tips, and get to know the program better. Remember that at touchmba.com, you can get some free school selection help. At the end of the show, Brandon talked about, really knowing what's important to you and then basing your short list of MBA programs on that criteria. And that's what we try to do at touchmba.com is, we ask you, well, what's important to you? What is it? Is it ranking? Is it the size of the class? Is it location? Is it, career placements, stats? And then based on what's important to you, we offer you a matching set of schools. Hopefully some of you will go check that out and give that free service a shot. Anyways, here's my conversation with Brandon Kirby. It's my pleasure to introduce our next guest. Brandon Kirby is the Director of MBA Marketing and Admissions at the Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University. Brandon, welcome to the Touch MBA podcast.
Darren, thank you so much. It's a marvel of technology that we're able to speak despite being so far away from each other. Hopefully today, my goal is to not bore your listeners to tears with things. So we'll maybe do a check halfway through to make sure people are still awake. But thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, for sure. And a little bit of Touch MBA history for you. I actually interviewed an admissions officer from Rotterdam 6 years ago, and it was the first podcast we'd actually done with a European business school. So now 6 years later, we're coming back to interview you. And I can't wait to learn more about this program. But first, if you don't mind, you have a really unique background for a director of MBA admissions. Could you tell us a little bit more about, your professional background and how you ended up at the Rotterdam School of Management?
Yeah, whenever people do the LinkedIn stalk on me,
which I did,
I think which a lot of people do, I do get those questions of, well, wait a second, you have a different background. So I do have a soft spot in my heart for the quote non-traditional MBA backgrounds, which I think increasingly is more people than you would expect. So a quick history of me. I went to a small liberal arts college in Greenville, South Carolina, graduated with a degree in English after about 4 different majors. So I was on the 5-year plan. So if anyone else was on the 5-year plus plan, I'm right there with you. When I graduated, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Having a degree in English, I figured I could either write books, I could teach, or I could be unemployed. And none of those 3 things sounded ideal to me. So I went into the restaurant business. So I worked in the restaurant business for about 10 years and was the owner of a restaurant for many of those years. It was actually a fondue restaurant in the US. So I learned a lot about customer service, about dealing with difficult situations, about wine, about all kinds of different things. So that's really where I cut my teeth on the management side very early on. After about 10 years of that, I got kind of bored in doing that. So I switched into the marketing and advertising space. At 33, I was the world's oldest intern. I actually interned at an agency in the city I was in, which was Charlotte, North Carolina, and did that for a few years. Halfway into my tenure there, I decided to go back to school and get my MBA. And I did a program. It's actually one of our sister programs that we offer here, which is called the 1MBA program. So it's an executive program from 2012 to 2014. Midway through that program, I did exactly what we tell our students not to do, which is I opened my own company. Again, I opened an advertising agency with 3 other guys, opened in the basement of one of their houses, true startup story, hot in the summer, freezing cold in the winter, but grew it to a pretty good size before I left to come to RSM in the kind of fall of 2016. So it's been almost 2 years. And you asked how did I get here? And I think it speaks to the power of the people that you go through an MBA program with. The programs director of the full-time and the MBA program here was actually in my program. So she was on the RSM side of the program where I was at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. But we shared a global team together. And she had a marketing advertising background as well. So she took the role as the programs director here at RSM for those programs. And then a couple summers ago, we were on the phone. I was talking to her about maybe looking to make a change, and she mentioned this role to me. And so she was very instrumental in presenting the opportunity for me that I didn't even know existed at the time. So I came, interviewed for the role, was offered the position, and then actually moved 6 weeks later from the U.S. And I have a wife and a daughter, so we all sort of moved together. So that's a little bit about me. So I do have that non-traditional background, as I guess we would say in the industry. I don't have or didn't have a lot of experience in the higher education space before arriving here, although I had done a program, so I knew it from the student side, but not so much the administrator side. And I think that was deliberate on the part of RSM. My predecessor did a really fantastic job with growing the program and really getting it to a good state. And then they were looking for someone to sort of continue those efforts, but to also really broaden how we approach marketing, how we approach that side of things, while also looking at the admissions side as well. So it's been a very fast-paced 2 years for me, but that's a little bit about me.
Wow. So, oh gosh, I have so many questions about Rotterdam, the Netherlands, what it's like living there. We'll get to that. And as well as, I always find it interesting when entrepreneurs go back to get their MBA and how effective they think it is and how it adds value to their skill set. Hopefully we'll get to that as well. But let's first start with the question I always like to start with on these school interviews, which is, in your opinion, what makes this business school, the Rotterdam School of Management MBA, unique from all the others?
Wow. I get that question a lot when I travel and meet with candidates. The first thing I always point to is our mission statement, which is to be a force for positive change in the world. We recently went through an accreditation review, and there was a lot of questions around that. That's not a traditional business school mission statement. It's something you might see more of a corporate side of things or more of an NGO side of things. But we believe here at RSM that business can solve some of the world's biggest challenges. And the mission statement is based off of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals put forth by the United Nations, which covers things like sustainability, which is something that we've always been known for, but it really goes much further than that. So it looks at gender equality, sustainable cities, access to quality education. So a lot of different areas that we feel the school can play a role both in what we teach, but then also in the graduates that we put out into the world afterwards. So the mission statement, I think, is something that I feel at a macro level is something that really sets us apart from other schools. And it's not just lip service. It's how we approach it in the programs, MBA programs, the master's programs, even our bachelor's, which we have with Erasmus University. We really have a lot of that there. The other thing I think that really makes us unique, it's a two-part thing. One is how international we are. Despite being in the Netherlands, we're 97% international year over year. So that means that only 3 or 4%, depending on the year, come from the Netherlands. So most of our students are coming from everywhere around the world. So no different than your listeners who might be listening to us in Tokyo all the way to Sao Paulo, Brazil. We have a lot of people in the program. But to take that a step further, what I think really makes us unique is the outcome. A lot of an MBA is also not only the learning, but it's the outcome. What happens afterwards? And of those 97% year over year, about 70 to 75% come from outside of the European Union. And that's important when you consider that about 85% of those students, when they graduate, stay in Europe. So we have a very strong success rate of being able to place graduates from around the world in the Netherlands, but also in other European countries as well. So for a candidate who's looking to make the move to Europe to study, but to also get a few years of experience afterwards, there's very few programs that can compete with that track record. So again, I could mention a lot of things, but we're really most known for the internationalization, but then also for the mission statement, which we've adopted.
That's awesome. And I know that you guys also start in January, and you have roughly about 140 students, right, each year?
Correct. Yes, that's
so. Correct. How are you able to achieve such fantastic career outcomes in such a short period of time? I mean, you're not only working with the MBA degree itself and everything that happens during that time, but in that 1 year span.
I think it's a couple of things. Let's talk about the school side first. On the selection side, we really take a lot of that into account when we're reviewing candidates' profiles. Everything from how are they going to be as leaders after they graduate, to are their expected goals realistic? We try to be honest with people. That's not to say that you can't do anything that you want. I mean, remember, I went from being in the restaurant business to being in advertising. So far be it for me to tell a particular person, you can't do that. But it's also to set the proper expectations on the way in. So the admissions team does a very good job with that, of having those honest conversations of, okay, look, you want to be a consultant, that's great. But what in your background or your history can really speak to that? How are you going to sell yourself? And again, not to say that you can or you can't, but it's also about setting the proper expectations. Once someone is in the program and working with the careers team from all the various program, and whether that be looking at LinkedIn profiles and CV rewriting, working on their personal narrative, helping them figure out what they might want to do post-MBA. So the preparation part, if you will, starts very early on in the program. So that's number one. Secondarily, having a lot of companies come on campus to recruit, having a lot of career fairs, and the alumni network. Don't forget, the Netherlands is, relatively speaking, a small country. It's 17 million people. There's actually more bikes than there are people in this country. And which is crazy. But so if you come to the Netherlands, be prepared to get a bike. And if you buy a bike, buy at least 3 bike locks, because otherwise you'll fall prey to a big statistic of bike theft. But being that we're the number one school in the Netherlands in the Benelux region, and we have such a really strong alumni network, both through our full-time program, but also our executive programs, we have a very strong alumni network, especially when it comes to hiring of full-time graduates. And we see that a lot, where the entry point oftentimes is a CV that passes through an alum who either hands it to the right person, or maybe they're the hiring manager themselves. So I think that's the other thing about school related. The last thing I would say is really, I think the philosophy of the Dutch in general, of being welcoming and open to all kinds of different talent from all around the world. The Dutch are the best non-native English-speaking country in the world, so that you can study and work here without really speaking the language. I'm a prime example of that. Although I am taking lessons now, for the first year and a half, the Dutch I learned was what I picked up from just daily life. So I think that's important, because most of our students are placing into larger international organizations. Obviously, the smaller you go, the more important it is to speak the local language. And the longer you're here, just for quality of life, it's better to speak the local language. But I think the philosophy of the Netherlands in general is that they're okay with people coming from other places. It's about talent. What can you add? What value can you add to the organization? And I think they're also more open to people who maybe are transitioning careers. So that's where we see a lot of people who maybe had a marketing background, who went into something financial related, or someone who was a consultant that went into PR. They hire a lot of times for the person, not necessarily for the role. So I think all of those things working together really contribute to having a relatively high success rate for placement. 90% of our students are employed within 3 months, 96% or so within 6 months of graduation. So all of those things taken together, I think really contribute to that success factor.
And you mentioned how Rotterdam really takes this philosophy of being a force of positive change in the world very seriously. I'd be curious to hear how that plays out in your curriculum, And also, I'd like to hear your thoughts on, having gone through another MBA program yourself, like how do you think Rotterdam is unique academically?
Sure. So on the Force for Positive Change side, I always tell people that it's not just about sustainability. RSM in the Netherlands in general have always been recognized for renewable energy and sustainable approaches to business and to management. It's just when you live essentially underwater, which the Netherlands is underwater, technically speaking, or not even technically speaking, it is, you have to take a very pragmatic approach to how you do things. So I think that if you look at the curriculum, whether it be our personal leadership development that runs throughout the entirety of the program, whether it be through responsible management of people, whether it be through more CSR-focused courses in that particular section, that's one of the ways that we deliver on that. We also have an advanced career concentration, which happens in our third term, which is focused on sustainability, as well as electives that would focus on things like circular economy, again, going back to responsible management practices. So there's a lot of things that we incorporate there within the curriculum. In the admissions department, starting next year, because we've been working through a lot of changes this year, our essay question will change. And we can talk about the admissions process later, but the essay question will be, how have you been a force for positive change in your world? Because I think the key is it's often too easy to go for these really large golden rings that we reach for. So building buildings or really large things. But I think it's also important to look at positive change can be on the local level, can be on the individual level. So we're really challenging upcoming candidates to say, how have you made a difference in your world? And that could be teaching someone how to read. It could be, going to a retirement community and just being there for someone who might not have any family around. Or it could be larger things like, taking a year off from work to go be in the jungles of Peru to work with farmers there, which is a story we have of a student who's coming in this year. So we have that, but then we've also included Force for Positive Change Scholarship. We have 2 of those, and there are 50% scholarships to the program that are really based on students who have demonstrated a will and a desire and an action to being a force for positive change. So that's how we've done that through the admissions side. Now, going back to your question as far as academically, what makes the program stand out? RSM is not known as a finance school or a consulting school or any particular school as far as disciplines after graduation. And I'm actually pretty proud of that. If you look at the incoming students that we have any given year, the range of industries and job functions is so vast. I would argue much broader than other universities, perhaps other schools. I don't mean that's better or worse. I just mean that it's different. So because of that, when you look at the placement that we have afterwards, it's equally as varied. Yes, we place double-digit percentages into consulting, into finance, but it's not like 75% of our graduates go into those 2 particular areas. So I think that's important to say from the outset for people. And I have no problems in saying that. If someone says to me, I want to be an investment banker, I usually say, look, we can provide you a great education and great opportunities, but there might be a better fit for you if that's really what your heart is set on. And I think that's important from an admission side, to be honest with people. I want students who are here, who want to be here, and who have made a decision that they can be happy with afterwards. Academically drilling down and speaking to where our strengths are. We have PhD professors. We have very small classrooms. Even though we have 140 students, that gets broken down into 3 cohorts. When you go into the class, so you have this intimate class size, but you have a larger overall group. So you have the benefit of experience and knowledge sharing on a macro level. But when you go into the classroom, you're not just a number. So I think that's something that really stands out. I think one other thing it relates to academics is our approach to experiential learning. And the one thing that stands out for me would be our living management project. And this is a 3-week-long consulting project that happens in our third term, where you apply all the academic learnings from the first 2 terms on a live business challenge. So we bring in companies from the outside with real challenges, and that challenge is presented to different groups. And you work as a team for the next 3 weeks to come up with a recommendation on how to solve or how to approach that challenge, how to address it. And you present back to the executives, you'll do a company visit. So there's a lot of things around that that make it pretty special. And because it is a live challenge, oftentimes the solutions are implemented. Not always, but they're implemented. And I think that's pretty special for students who can work on a case study where there is an outcome that that can actually be used. It's not just something they're looking at in theory. We're going through an academic review now as far as different things that we're looking to add, which we typically do year over year in our electives. We're able to add courses much faster in the electives than we are in the main curriculum, but we're going through a curriculum review now. So watch this space. I think we'll have some other things, some other pretty cool things that we're looking at. We'll be integrating into the program over the next year or so. Maybe we can have this conversation, hopefully not 6 years from now. Hopefully we can have another conversation sooner than that where I can share more updates.
Yeah. And you mentioned uprooting your family to move to Rotterdam. I mean, as an American moving to the Netherlands, what has that been like? And I'd love to hear your comments on why should our listeners consider pursuing a full-time MBA in Rotterdam, the Netherlands?
Yeah, a lot of things. How much time do we have? One of the first things about Rotterdam, especially, is how diverse it is. There's 170 plus nationalities within the city itself. So I don't care where you're from. I guarantee you will not be the only person who looks like you walking down the street. And I think that's really important, especially when you're coming from certain parts of the world. I get asked a lot in the Middle East and also in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, for example. I wear a hijab. Do I need to be worried about that? Because there obviously are some places in Europe where it isn't as friendly, perhaps, for people coming from certain parts of the world. So I think the safety factor, I think the internationalization part is important. I also think the English-speaking portion is very, very, not only for jobs, but also for quality of life. For example, if we have candidates who are coming with a family member or a spouse or a partner or kids, you might be in the program 9 to 5 or 9 to whatever it is, but your partner is going to be out there living in the world here in Rotterdam. And I think it's important for them to not only have a social network of maybe people who are from where you're from that perspective, but then also going to the store. Can you go shopping? And maybe you don't speak Dutch right away, but can you get around? And the answer is yes. So I think that that's something about Rotterdam especially, and the Netherlands in general, that's really nice. Rotterdam is the largest port in Europe, so a lot of goods flow through here. So because of that, you have a lot of international companies here. You have The Hague that's 25 minutes away. So again, you have a lot of internationalization there. And of course, Amsterdam is about 35 minutes away by train. So the city is very well connected, both within the country, but also within the continent. We have an airport here. It's a 40-minute flight to London City Airport. So that's a quick one. You can get to Paris within 2 hours direct from the train. You can get to Brussels. You can get to a lot of different places very quickly and very easily from here, which I think is something that's very nice. And then the last thing I would say is that it's clean. Everything works. Public transportation is great. Everything is interconnected in that way. Some down things or things that I think took me a little bit to get accustomed to. Stores close here very early. I think very early, 5 or 6 o'clock during the week. With some exceptions, some of the grocery stores might stay open until 8 or 9. But if you're coming from a country where there are night markets, if you're coming from a country like the US where there's 24/7 availability at a large box store, that just doesn't exist here. But that's because the Dutch believe in a very strong relationship between work-life balance, and which is another crucial part, I think, of being in the Netherlands and experiencing that. And I think the other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't mention is, the weather is definitely not like a Greek island. The weather, it's hot in the summer. It gets relatively cold in the wintertime. There's a lot of overcast days in the winter. The sun in the summertime stays up very late, which I think is fantastic. So you really have those long days, unless you have kids, because it's always tough when it's 10:30 at night and the sun is still up and you realize that your kid hasn't gone to bed because you didn't realize what time it was. But those are things that, you really do get used to. And honestly, especially if you're in an MBA program, you won't see much of the outside world for the first 6 months anyway. So it could be, raining fire and you might not even. So by the time you actually have time to enjoy your life again, it's summertime. I mean, I say that half jokingly, but it's whereas some schools, the joke in the U.S. is when you go to college, sometimes you might gain weight because you're eating pizza and drinking things. Here, it's almost you lose weight because by the time you get out of the classroom or out of your after class studies, the stores are already closed. So you're eating cheese and crackers. So maybe I shouldn't mention that in a podcast, but I'm all about being truthful. So.
Yeah, let's set some expectations, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. And so where do the full-time MBA students live? Do most of them live close to campus, on campus? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have a housing department that helps with that. Every year we have access to around 80 to 90 housing units that we have contracts and partnerships with. About 40 of them are very near the building, within, I'd say, 50 meters or so of
Oh
the
my
building.
gosh.
So,
Wow. Okay.
yes. So for those 40 students, they can roll out of bed and straight into class. After that, we have other housing units that are about 10 or 15 minutes away by walking, so even about 5 minutes away by tram. And then we have some additional units that are about 20 minutes away from campus. So like most schools in Europe, for the MBA side, we don't really have on-campus housing per se. So housing is relatively close. And I think, again, going back to the whole public transportation point, it's very easy to get around either by tram, by metro, by bus, so that students don't have to live next door and still be able to have a relatively easy commute, both to and from the campus. And the housing department is there once a student registers to help facilitate them finding spaces to live. And I think the outgoing students, the graduating class, also does a very good job with sort of passing the torch to the incoming class in that regards, of showing them where different housing options are and things like that.
Yeah, it sounds super convenient, actually. And I had just had one more question about kind of the program and being in the Netherlands. You guys really place an emphasis on this idea of Dutch thinking.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious, as an outsider, as a foreigner, like, what does that mean to you, Dutch thinking? And how do you think that will kind of affect the education experience, overall, not just in the classroom, of the students?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The Dutch are very pragmatic. They're very direct as well. So they'll cut straight to the point, which can be off-putting in the beginning sometimes if you're not accustomed to that. It's not rude. It's just direct. They want to get straight to the heart of the matter and address it and then keep moving on. So that's part of that. The Dutch are also known for being humble and not bragging or boasting, which could be, for some of your listeners, this might be the first time they've been at Rotterdam School, because we're not standing at the top of a mountain shouting about how great we are or things like that. So I think that the matter of being humble, so pragmatic, humble, and then also going back to the work-life balance, recognizing that work is important, but it shouldn't define who you are. And I think that's important. And it's oftentimes lost in other cultures, and again, that's not a good or a bad. Different cultures work in different ways for different reasons. I think it can be a challenge if you do come from a culture where the work environment or the expectations of you as an employee are very high as far as the amount of work you do, the amount of hours that you put in. It can be a little challenging to adjust sometimes. You have feelings of guilt, maybe. Maybe I should stay that extra hour to do that, to do this. But that's not what the working environment is like here. It's not lazy by any stretch. Don't misinterpret that for being lazy or being sort of laissez-faire. It's just the mentality. So that does filter into, especially the notion of not being being humble, of helping one another. I think that's the last thing I would say. Again, the Dutch work very well together as a society to make sure that everything works and that everyone is taken care of. I think they do a fantastic job with that. And I think you also see that in the classroom with us. That sort of spills over, that collaborative nature of getting things done really spills over into the classroom as well.
Very cool. I really appreciate those thoughts. Let's move towards the admissions side of things.
Sure.
So you've been in that director of admissions seat for 2 years. What are the fit qualities you're looking for?
Yeah. There are three things I think that I look for, or we look for within the team, that are indicators of success in the program and then after the program. I mentioned the collaborative nature. That's sort of the overarching theme. Are you willing to work with others? Are you, not willing to stab someone in the back or to pull someone back in order to get ahead? I think we're seeing a paradigm shift in the industry, but also in business in general, about how to approach being competitive. What does that mean now in 2018 and beyond, especially for this upcoming generation of business leaders who maybe have a different viewpoint on how we should work together or how competition should look? So that's one thing. But when you get to the individual, I think there are three areas that we really look for. And that is, are you open to change? Are you open to changing yourself? Are you open to trying to change the world around you? An MBA program for many, many people is one of the last times in your life where you'll be able to take, in our case, a year, since that's how long the program is, to take a year and really reflect and focus on yourself without being called selfish. Because after this program, your life accelerates, your career path accelerates. Maybe you have a family now, so you have different obligations. And so you can't focus on yourself like you can now. So you really need to be open to change. Open to challenge is another one. And that's also challenging yourself, putting yourself in uncomfortable situations, that resilience factor, but also challenging those around you, challenging those views. When you hear something that, well, maybe you agree with, but you want to be the devil's advocate. So you challenge it just to do that. I think challenge is critical because there will be a lot of challenges in a program. So are you open to that? Are you accepting of that? And then the last one, which I feel is maybe the most difficult one to really highlight, but that's, are you open to opportunities? And opportunities could mean, okay, job opportunities or things of that nature. But maybe even deeper than that, there will be things in an MBA program that don't go your way. It might be a grade that you get. It might be a team that's not performing the way that you would like it to. And you have choices in those situations. You can get angry and point fingers outside. Well, this professor didn't see my point, or, this group member isn't doing it the way I would do it. But those are learning opportunities, to really turn it around and say, okay, this paper that I wrote, maybe it wasn't as well received by the professor as I thought it was. So rather than just getting that grade and just, throwing it in the trash can, maybe you go and you speak with that professor. You say, hey, listen, I really felt that this was, answering the question you were looking for, but clearly I was off the mark. Can we talk about that? And in the case of teams that underperform, rather than getting angry at that person and holding it in, really using it as a way to say, okay, well, most likely in your life after the MBA program or in your life before the MBA program, you worked on a group project where someone, for whatever reason, didn't pull their weight or didn't do things the way you thought they should. So use this as a learning opportunity to how do I approach this person? How can I make it a better outcome? What can I learn from this? An MBA program, the environment of an MBA is a safe environment. And this is something that I say to candidates the first day of class when we sort of hand off from marketing and admissions to the program team. I say, look, this is a safe environment for you. It's okay to fail here. And of course, everyone laughs. And I say, I don't mean fail your classes because we don't want you to do that. But what I mean by that is, let's say you're not a great public speaker, but you know that you want to work on that. Find those opportunities to put yourself in the position to have to present projects, papers, whatever that might be. Because it's better for you to completely fall on your face in front of your classmates who want to see you succeed versus waiting until you get into the boardroom and you're going and presenting to the C-suite your concept or idea. So this all goes back to opportunity. So it's collaborative, the overarching. It's open to change, open to challenge, and willing to seek and open to find opportunities. Those things bundled together, regardless of GMAT score, regardless of anything else, are really critical to what we look for candidates in the program. Before they enter, I feel they're critical during the program for success and become even more critical when our graduates go back out into the world and are working professionals again. So maybe a longer answer than you wanted, but just to give you the insight into what we look for.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, gosh, I love that. I love that it's very clear too in terms of what your team is looking for. I mean, I do have to ask on the hard side of things, do you guys have any cutoffs in terms of GMAT score, GPA, work experience?
Yeah, so for the full-time program, usually we look for 3 years plus work experience. We have had some exceptional cases of candidates with 2 years of experience. So I would say in that regard, we're always open to exploring, to take a look to see what someone has done. For example, if someone graduated college, worked a year, and then took 2 years off to travel around the world to work for the Peace Corps, okay, maybe you only have 1 year of professional working experience, but you have some other experience that is interesting and will add value to the classroom. So it's not really a hard line in that perspective, but typically speaking, we seek for people to have at least 3 years of working experience by the start of the program or very close to that. GPA, I'll just be honest here. I
yes.
mean, that's sort of the whole point of doing these things. If I look at myself and my undergraduate GPA, it was nothing to write home about. But I also know there were reasons for that. And in my case, maybe I didn't go to the right school. And instead of withdrawing from that school and going to somewhere else, I made the decision to not quit. I don't want to quit. I'm not a quitter. I'm going to put my head down and power my way through, which is why it took me 5 years, going back to what I mentioned earlier on. So oftentimes, the average age of our candidates is 30. And we have older and younger, without a doubt. And so it's not uncommon when you see someone who has grades that maybe were questionable, but typically we have a conversation about it. And I'll give you an example. So we had a student, and actually wasn't for our full-time program, it was one of our other programs, but the story still remains the same. This person was a fantastic candidate, ticked all of the boxes. But I did have some question marks over whether or not they could handle the program academically, especially the quant side, because they had a liberal arts, humanities background. So I got on the phone with this person, and we're going through, and I said, listen, we've been on the phone for about 20 minutes. And I said, I'm just going to be honest with you. The person I'm speaking to on the phone doesn't reflect the undergraduate grades that I'm seeing, in this person's case, about 10 years prior. And I said, what's going on here? There's a disconnect for me. Help me connect the dots. And they were like, well, look, back then I wasn't sure of who I was as an individual. But then I finally realized who I was. And this person was a gay man, but he came out during these years of his college time. And so that was almost like a huge burden off of his chest that he could actually be who he was. So from that point forward, after coming out, he had straight A's. And so I think it speaks to the fact that for most people, there's a reason why they had maybe low GPAs. That's not to say that they always are going to get in, but I think having that conversation, and that's the benefit of being in the scheme of MBA schools, a relatively smaller school. We can have those conversations with people where you can tell us what's going on. And yeah, you can write an optional essay and explain it, but there's something to be said about having a conversation with someone, having a Skype call and looking them in the eye and saying, look, what happened? And to that point, what will you do differently now? Again, it's not uncommon for us to see people who struggled in quant-based courses in their undergraduate degrees. I would have been in the same boat. And so the conversation that I had with the admissions director of my program was, well, what will you do if or when you start to struggle? What's that plan look like? Having that conversation. So I think that undergraduate GPA definitely plays a role. And obviously, there are certain industries where that matters more so than others. So again, if someone's looking to go into a particular industry where that matters, then that's a different conversation. But I think that as business schools, our job should be to find the best talent possible. And if someone's undergraduate degree was from 6, 7, 8 years ago, especially think about how much you change as a 21-year-old or 22-year-old to a 28-year-old, right? The amount of change that a person goes through in that 6 years is almost more rapid than any other span in your life. Not so much physically, but mentally. Figuring out your place in the world, figuring out who you are, figuring out what you're passionate about. Most people don't know that when they do their undergraduate degrees. They're going to school because they need to so they can find a job afterwards. Go in, and some people they do, and they know like a laser what they want to do, but that is an exception and not the rule. So I think GPA is important to look at, but again, we take everything as a sum of the whole. The final one is the GMAT, which I'm sure you ask all of your interviewees. And I'm sure to a certain degree, we all probably say the same thing, which is it doesn't matter as much. It matters, but it's part of the overall package and everything else. And yes, I could say all of that too. I've gone on record saying that I'm sure there are plenty of people in the industry, and maybe this is because I'm not from the industry. I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of GMAT retakes.
Interesting.
There are exceptions to this rule. There are scores that are very, very, very weak that I do question whether or not a person, question's a hard word, where I have concern if they can handle the program academically, usually on the quant side, because it is very intense, especially because not everyone had statistics or, different financial modeling things in their undergraduate. So this is really the only way we can sort of check if they can handle it. However, let's say that a student has a normal score. Now, our average score is 640. So if I have someone who has a 600 or a 620, which is below our average, which of course, being that it's an average, you know that we have scores less than 640. I'm not giving anything away there. What's the benefit for me to ask them to retake a GMAT? Now, again, I'm going to have colleagues in the industry who are going to fight me on this, and I can respect that. But this is me as the director of Rotterdam School of Management. This is my opinion. All right. What changes in you as an individual if you retake the GMAT a month later, 2 months later, a year later, and you go from a 600 to a 660? What changes in you? Is your cognitive ability that much better? Maybe, maybe not. So I think that if it's about rankings, that's selfish on the school's part. And that's not what we're in the business for doing, right? We should be in a customer service business. And this is maybe a different viewpoint that I have than other people in this industry. Maybe not, but our job is to find the best talent. And does that mean they always have high GMATs? No, of course not. Because just as there are plenty of people with low GMATs who are going to be successful, I can tell you, I've done an analysis. There are plenty of high GMATs who didn't perform well in the program, and it wasn't based on academics. It's because they didn't have the resilience to make it through a program. Well, that's not tested by the GMAT. So usually I'm not a fan of retakes. In the event of supremely low scores, where then it becomes, can you handle the program academically? Absolutely. If someone is dead set on going into specific industries that really look at GMAT score as part of the interview process, then yes, I might suggest to someone, if you're looking to go into consulting, for example, one of the bigs, you might need a higher GMAT because that might come into consideration during your application process. But that's on you. That's not on the school. So, I try to really put myself in the position of the individual who is working full time, who might have family or friend obligations, and is trying to study for the GMAT. And that's not to say that you shouldn't work hard for what you want, which some people make the argument, well, it could show that they're really intent on wanting to come to this program or to do an MBA. It shows they're serious about it. But I think the fact that you took the GMAT to begin with says something. Now, look, if you didn't study, if you just went in cold and did it, okay, you get what you deserve, I would say, unless you really knock it out of the park. But I think that the GMAT is, obviously, it's a huge stress point for the candidates. It's tricky for the schools to deal with because we don't want to say there's a hard cutoff, and there isn't for us. But I would say kind of the final thing is this is very specific to RSM. Different schools are going to have different philosophies. And again, if I had tens of thousands of applications a year, I might need a cutoff point to just sort of deal with the volume. But for better or for worse, I'm not in that situation. So when I see strong candidates who have a great working profile and track record, and they're great people who maybe have GMATs that are weaker than we'd like to see, I get the opportunity to have that conversation with them, no different than the GPA conversation. Then we can make that assessment. And sometimes it works out in their favor. And sometimes, all things taken together, they're not admitted to the program. So again, hopefully that's maybe something a little different than you get from other schools. And who knows, maybe I'll get a LinkedIn message, or a DM in my Instagram from someone else saying I'm crazy for saying it. But I mean, that's what it is. I've sat on both sides of the table.
Absolutely.
As have other admissions directors, don't get me wrong. But I try to really think about, what is my job? What is the job of this admissions team? What is our job of us as a school? And it's to find the best talent, prepare them to be great leaders, and put them back out in the world. And sometimes they have great GMATs and sometimes they don't. And that's okay. But we have the opportunity to really speak with people about it.
No, I appreciate your candid thoughts there. I really do. And I also want to make it very clear that Rotterdam is unique as well in that you guys are actively trying to connect with applicants before they apply as well. So if someone listening is thinking, oh, well, what is a supremely low GMAT? Like, I'm not sure what that number is. I mean, can they get in touch with you guys, a year or two in advance to actually just basically ask you, like, is this, what can I do? Do you guys talk to applicants about that before they apply?
Absolutely. I would say that at least 80% of our applicants, well, let's even take it further back. It's one of the very first questions I think people ask, because the GMAT is kind of one of those unknown quantities. It's like, until you take it, you don't really know what to expect. And so we do have that conversation a lot with people. But if someone is interested to learn, okay, well, he said supremely low, what does that mean? They can reach out to me on LinkedIn. They're more than welcome to go to our website, to the admissions page, and we have all of our admissions managers who are separated by region. So if you're from the Americas, it would be one person. If you're from Asia, it's another person. Any one of us would be happy to field those questions. And that's really what we're here for. And again, what we're able to do, we're known for that personal approach. So even if someone is very early stage in the consideration process or just curious after hearing this, feel free to reach out. It doesn't take me long to do a quick response. I mean, I say this and who knows, maybe I'll get 500 emails tomorrow. But that's what we're here for. So we're happy to answer any of those questions or fill in any gaps that might have been left with one of the answers today.
Awesome. I will be sure to link to both of those links that you mentioned. And
yep.
In terms of what applicants can do to improve their chances, what tips would you give our listeners?
Yeah, be real. Nobody's perfect. I think showing some vulnerability never hurts. A lot of emotional intelligence when you're able to do that. And if any of your listeners doesn't know what emotional intelligence is, I highly recommend doing a quick Google search. It's basically founded around 5 different tenets of self-regulation, self-motivation, communication skills, people skills, and empathy. So looking at that and understanding about self, especially the self-reflective part, really being able to look within yourself, because that's what a lot of an MBA program is about. In addition to the academics, it's understanding who you are and what makes you tick. So I think that's one thing. I'm sure other people have said this too, but I'll repeat it again because we just had it happen just last week with a candidate. Make sure that your essays and your reference letters are for the proper school. It's great that you're applying to Chicago Booth. I admire you for that, but please do me the courtesy of at least removing that from your essay. I know it's challenging when a candidate is applying for 3, 4, 5 plus schools that all might have 3 essays. So you're looking at 15 total essays to write. The joke I have with our incoming students on the first day of class is to say, well, no Control C, Control V. And everyone laughs because they know what I'm talking. Yeah, you're laughing now because you know what I'm talking about. So again, this goes back to just being real with people. I feel that we're really on the level and really transparent with our candidates. We just ask for the same thing. One other thing beyond maybe the other things that have been mentioned before, either by myself or by other guests, is this is a relationship. Even if a candidate decides to go somewhere else, there's this interesting dynamic that happens. And again, maybe this is pulling the curtain back a little bit for your candidates or for your listeners. There's an interesting dynamic that happens between a candidate and a school once a candidate has been accepted into a program. The balance of power shifts. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know what you mean.
Right. And I know your background in admissions. You know what I mean. And so I think just remembering, look, we're all human beings here and everyone wants what's best for them. The school wants what's best for them. The candidate wants what's best for them. But just be honest, and and I'm saying this to maybe hopefully prevent this from happening once in the future, but please don't tell a school that you are their top choice unless it's true. I'm just going to be honest. It's again about being transparent. If we're all in this together, candidates, schools, students, alums, we're all in this together. If RSM is legitimately your first choice, that's great. But if it's not, don't say that it is to get certain things to happen. Either you want more scholarship dollars, or you want a fast track, or you want something outside of the norm of the admissions process. Just be real with us. Be like, look, you know what? I have an offer from another school that the deadline's coming up. That doesn't surprise us. You should be thinking about more than one option. No surprise there. But be real with us. Because there's nothing more frustrating when someone's like, oh yeah, RSM's my top choice. If I only get X or this thing happens, I'm definitely coming to RSM. And then you think about it in the interest of customer service, and you're like, yeah, okay, you know what? We've been speaking with this person for a while. We really like them as a candidate. We'll work with them on this, And then when things pan out, it's like, oh, actually, I'm going here. And things happen. I get that. Sometimes it's finance. Sometimes it's a family member. I understand that. But maybe you just be a little bit more transparent. Hey, I have a deadline coming up from another school. I'd like a few days to consider your offer to, can I have an extension? Or can you maybe give me a decision a little bit sooner? For us, for right now, we're able to do that. Moving forward, we might not be able to. We might have a deadline day and a decision day like some other schools do. But for now, it's not like that. So I think just throughout the whole process, just be real with us. We're people too, and we get it. If someone goes to another school that's a better fit for them or whatever the reason, that's great. Congratulations. There's no ill will. But I think that there is this dynamic shift in the relationship once a candidate is accepted to a program, which is fine, But just remember that, it is a relationship, and We have had students, the last thing I'll say on this, we have had students who have been accepted to other programs, gone to other programs, only for whatever reasons to not be able to attend those schools, have to come back to us. And do I care that we were someone's second choice school? Not really. I mean, if they're a great candidate and they fit, we accepted them. So clearly, we thought they were good enough to get accepted, but that's where the relationship comes back into play. You never burn a bridge in life and in business and in business schools. You never burn a bridge. Just be real with people. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I love that too, because, maybe it's also good for your program that those applicants aren't in your program too, because they might do the same thing to employers that you set them up with.
Absolutely.
Forever. I mean, of course, people change. I don't mean to say it's like a one-time thing and that marks you, but yeah, it is a sign. Let me just ask you one more question on the admissions side. Do you guys focus on any particular or place more emphasis on any particular part of the application process, whether that's interviews, essays, resume, career goals?
Yeah, I mean, the interview is a big part of what makes or breaks a candidate, especially those candidates that are on the fence. Maybe they do have a low GMAT or a low GPA. A strong interview can really help. And vice versa, people who have strong GPAs and GMATs might really have an interview that we realize they're not, that going back to that fit, they're not for us. And so that can actually push people out. So the interview is really big. And that's what goes back to being who you are and having concrete examples to the questions that you're asked. That's one thing. If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said that I didn't really care about recommendation letters. But as my growth within this industry, I've changed my stance on that. I like recommendation letters that show who the true candidate is. So please, when you're doing your recommendations and getting them sent out to people, at least for us, and I would think industry-wide, tell them to be honest. Everyone has a weakness. Everyone has things they can work on. Because if you didn't, you shouldn't be doing an MBA. You should be leading a company already somewhere.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So what are those things that you can work on? And it's not like we're going to see a weakness where it says, a common one I see is this person doesn't know when to delegate, or this person tries to take on too much. That's actually a crucial thing for me to know, because in the interview, I might say to you, how are you going to handle the workload? How are you, when you're in a group with a team member who underperforms, what are you going to do? And if the person says, oh, well, I'll probably pick up the slack. Okay, that's great. It's good because it shows that the referee actually knows who the person is. But then you can start asking the questions of, well, okay, what other things could you do? And why might that not be the best option? To see how their brain works, to see if they can start to recognize their blind spots or the areas they might need to improve on. So you're already starting that in the interview, which I think is pretty cool. You're sort of priming and prepping for when hopefully they get in, they eventually come to the program. So I think the letters of recommendation are really big. And then the last one I think that I placed personally, and I can't speak for the rest of the admissions team. Currently, we have an essay question. If one of your listeners applies for the January 2019 intake, so the one that we are actively building for now, there's a question that asks you what your most difficult decision was.
That's right.
In your life. And I think that one for me is a good window into who the person is, who the candidate is. So when you're writing your response to that question, if it's for this upcoming intake, the kind of joking example I give is, look, it was very difficult to pick which university to go to for my undergraduate degree, but I guarantee you that's probably not the most difficult decision I've made. So,
yeah.
Doesn't mean you have to bare your soul, but dig a little bit deeper than the surface to come up with something that will give us a better insight into who you are as a person.
Yeah, I love that. And does your interview have a special structure to it?
I call it active interviewing. So basically it's something I've redesigned with the team this year, how we approach it. There's not a series of 10 questions that everyone gets asked. There are some questions that are kind of mandatory. I won't say what those are, but that at least in some, maybe let me phrase it this way. The questions aren't mandatory, but the topics are mandatory because we interview based off of competencies. So we have certain competencies that we look for, and we have a bank of questions around that. And then the interviewer is also encouraged to ask follow-up questions based on what they hear from the students. So it's a very active listening and active interview style. you could call it behavioral to a certain degree. I definitely think it's conversational, because I think you find out more in conversational style interviews, because as people get comfortable, they start becoming who they really are.
Right.
Because I think the of an interview is like dance, like the interviewer is trying to project the seriousness, which it is, but the seriousness of what's going on. The candidates may be nervous and they don't want to say the wrong thing. But after like 15 or 20 minutes, no different than how we're doing here, you develop a relationship and a rapport with the interviewer. And so maybe you start to get information or things that either didn't show up in the CV or the application. And this could be good or bad. I'm not saying it's always bad. But, I didn't know that person was really resilient. There was nothing in their application that really showcased that. But in listening to how they're describing this and to seeing the emotions or, hearing the emotion in their voice, I can tell they're really passionate about this or they're really intrigued about that, which comes through in the interview style. So it's not a mandatory or a set series of questions, but it's really based on competencies. And then the interviewer is encouraged to sort of take the conversation where it will go while making sure we get the areas of information that we need to be able to make a good decision.
Got it. And your interviewers are all on the admissions committee, or are they students or alumni?
Yeah, it's a blend. So typically the admissions team, of course, does a lot of interviewing, but so does careers. Our careers team does interviewing.
Yeah.
Our programs team does interviewing as well. We do have alums who do interviews as well. We next year will be implementing Kira, the video essay platform.
Yes.
The video question platform. And my intent is to have alumni really more engaged in that regard of looking over those videos, just because it's less impact on their time. It's easier for scheduling purposes and everything else. So traditionally, I would say alums do probably less than 10% of our interviews at the moment. So predominantly admissions team, but also careers, programs, also play a role in the interview process. Careers especially, in cases where we just want a different look or a different viewpoint on things, we'll bring in careers. Because remember, with us, the recruiting side, even though I hate to use that word, but it's just the easiest way to say it, the people who are out there doing the recruiting are also part of the admissions process. So if you meet someone on the road as the recruiting officer, so to speak, of the Americas, they will see that candidate all the way through to admit or not admit. So there's no handoff midway through. So sometimes we want, and you can never interview your own candidate, for example, because that's just bias. But sometimes you want someone who hasn't had any contact at all to get a really unbiased viewpoint, of a candidate. So that's why we'll also use programs and careers.
It's very clear. No, I appreciate that. I also want to ask you about scholarships, and I'm just going to leave this one open-ended.
All right.
Tell us about scholarships. No. I mean, of course, I think, funding is a big issue for many of our listeners. And so it's about, like, how can I get into the best school that fits what I'm looking to do at the best cost, right? So
it's a function of finance. And I think that is really driven home to me a lot when, we're traveling around the world. Being in the Netherlands and me coming from the US, there's an inherent bias to forget that these are developed economies. And sometimes when you travel to places where that's not always the case, even people who have great jobs in other countries, it still is a really big hurdle. I was in a country recently where, and I always do this, and I recommend the admissions team do this too. Whenever you travel to a country, go on Google and type in the cost of our program and convert it to local currency. And then see what that local currency, what that amount will buy. Because it really puts you in the shoes of the person that you're speaking to. I think we forget sometimes in the business school world, not all of us, but some of us, forget what we're asking for people to do. We're asking people to essentially buy a car that they can't see. And, I know sometimes people get frustrated because candidates ask for money. And I'm like, you know what? When is the last time, like when you go to buy a car, especially in the US, this isn't everywhere, but we'll use the US for an example. When you go buy a car in the US, do you pay the sticker price that's on the window? No, you negotiate. So why shouldn't we expect it any differently? So for that reason, anyone who is accepted to move forward in the admissions process, so you submit your application and you're invited for an interview, so you're officially moving forward. Everyone who submits an application is automatically eligible for a scholarship. There's no application. There's no 500-word essay. This is also about simplifying the process for the candidate. It's about customer experience. If you remember, I said we have 3 essays this year. We have 1 essay next year, supplementing with video essays. I'm trying to streamline the process because I know how time consuming it can be, which isn't to say that people shouldn't put the effort, but it's also just being realistic with the world we live in. So we have 3 different kinds of scholarships, and you're eligible for all, whether it's you or me or anyone who's accepted to move forward in the admissions process. There's one based on diversity, one that's based on merit, and one that's based on financial needs. So the diversity one is where you're from, what you're doing, anything that adds diversity to the classroom. That's one. The second one is merit-based, so that's where the GMAT, GPA score comes into play. That's where having a higher GMAT or GPA would help you out. And then the third one is just, again, financial needs-based, like help, I need money. So about 4% of our candidates receive a scholarship of some kind. The range is anywhere from 5 to maybe 20,000 euros. And the cost of the program for this upcoming intake is 50,500. So that's anywhere from 10 to 20% of the, 10 to 20% of the program cost. Those are the types of scholarships that we have and the amounts. And about 40% year over year will receive a scholarship of some kind.
Got it.
So, I think it's about industry standard, maybe slightly higher than some schools, maybe slightly less than others. We're also part of Prodigy Finance. So candidates can apply through Prodigy Finance for loans. And then for students in the United States, or for anyone who has a U.S. citizen who is willing to co-sign on the loan, we can also process Sallie Mae loans. So for any U.S. listeners or people with U.S. citizens who are willing to co-sign on a loan, we can process Sallie Mae loans as well. But you're right. I mean, finance is a huge part. It's probably the biggest part. And kind of going back to what I was saying, it's important for us as an industry to remember not only the cost of the program, but the cost of living, the opportunity cost of coming out of the workforce. There's a lot and the risks. If you're in a really good job, especially in a developing economy, it's a huge risk, to leave that. And I think we need to remember that as an industry, that it's yes, we're giving a lot in return, but we're also asking a lot. And to be sensitive to that, I think is really, really important, that humanistic side of things.
And so it sounds like for those first 2 scholarships, the diversity and the merit ones, that's really about just showing that in your application, what unique perspective you bring and how awesome you are, right? So to speak. But in terms of the financial needs scholarship, is there there's not an extra essay box for that? Or people can just say, I need financial aid? Or how does that work?
So going back to the way things are as far as being a smaller school, very rarely, it happens, but very rarely does someone pop up on our radar solely at the application phase. Usually we've been in contact either via email or a Skype call or something else with our candidates. And even if someone does just show up and apply, we still reach out to them and have a conversation with them. So we're able, again, going back to being honest and real with people, we're able to have conversations to determine, okay, I need help. What does help look like? Because it's also about setting expectations. If someone says to me, look, I need a 90% scholarship, I can say from the beginning, that's probably not going to happen, just to set the expectation. So in terms of true financial needs, I think that scholarship's the one that is the utilized the least in general. Starting next year, I mentioned the Force for Positive Change scholarships. We'll have 2 of those that are 50% scholarships. We'll also have a scholarship for women in business, which will be a 15,000 euro scholarship. It's named after our, what we call ECWO, which is the Erasmus Center for Women in Organizations, which focuses on helping prepare young women to become strong business leaders. And so we've named a scholarship in honor of the director of that particular center. So that will be online starting next year. So there might be some application process around those 2 scholarships because they're special. But for the general scholarships that we have, it will remain where everyone is automatically considered. Because candidly, 95% of applicants indicated they wanted to apply for one of those scholarships. So it's like, all right, that part's not going to change. So again, let's streamline the process and have a better approach to things.
I got it. And I'm sure our listeners will be excited about those new scholarships. I mean,
definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
That sounds awesome. the final leg of our conversation is about careers. And we're kind of circling back to what you mentioned was, one of the unique differentiators of, do you guys call it RSM? RSM
Yes.
MBA? Okay. I wasn't sure if it was, Rotterdam MBA or RSM MBA. So yeah, like from a career perspective, I mean, I saw this line on your website, and I thought it was a very bold line, actually. You said, our dream job is setting you up to land yours. And so, yeah, how do you guys do that, and what makes you special from a career perspective?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier the personal leadership development portion of the program, which is an undercurrent throughout the entire curriculum. And it starts in the first week, and it covers everything from preparing your LinkedIn profile, reworking your CV, working on interview tips, those kind of things. And there's a lot of one-on-one coaching sessions that happens within that part of the curriculum. The career coaches are also integrated into the leadership development portion as well. And that's important because they're with the candidates from the very beginning. It's not uncommon for one of the first questions for candidates to be asked in those sessions is, why are you here? I'm here to get my MBA. Yeah, okay, great. But why are you here? They work very hard from the beginning to help students try to determine what their next move is going to be. For some, that's staying within an industry that they're in. And for others, that's completely changing industries. And so helping to reposition and to retool and to reshape the candidate to make themselves more attractive post-graduation is one of the things that they do. And that's the whole part about the dream job kind of thing. Not everyone knows what their dream job is when they come into an MBA, and that's okay. And I think it's kind of a misnomer that students need to know exactly what they're going to do after a program. I disagree with that. I think you need to have an idea of the direction and why you're doing an MBA, but to come in and say, well, I want to be this. Because if we do our jobs correctly as a school, we should present you with enough options and enough things that might cause you to pause and think like, I really wanted to go into finance, but now that I'm in marketing, I'm really interested in this. That's great. We're not trying to change people's minds, but if it happens, so be it. So that's what the part about dream job is. The first part about finding your dream job is knowing what that is. Now, as far as the practical side of things, I mentioned earlier a little bit about the recruitment efforts that we have on campus and the career fairs, the MBA alums and connecting candidates to students or alums in the Netherlands, which I think is a big part of that. But then a lot of the people who work in our career department have corporate recruiting backgrounds. So they come from the Randstads and from some other large corporate recruiting firms who have an inherent understanding of what companies are looking for. It's one thing to position and to put out into the marketplace, great graduates. Look at all these awesome, graduates are going to go do great things. But you also have to understand what corporations are looking for. And so, again, positioning and helping candidates to understand the right way to position themselves to potential hiring managers is crucial to be able to showcase the things that really matter to these corporations, to these companies that are looking to hire. So that's just a little insight into what we do and how we do it. And we put a lot of focus on that. And we have a very good ratio of careers managers, whatever you'd like to call them, career development managers to students. And so that's something that we put a heavy emphasis on because, again, to me, it's academics, but it's also outcomes. What is the outcome afterwards? And that's obviously what also goes into the decision-making process of candidates. It's a huge part of doing an MBA is, okay, well, what happens afterwards? So we put a heavy emphasis on that.
Yeah, and it sounds like, the school is really making an active effort to keep their ear to the ground, have these good relationships with your corporate partners to know what they are looking for, right? So I'm curious whether you've seen some changes in terms of the trends. You mentioned that you have such an international class. 85% of those students from outside the EU end up staying in Europe, right? Do you think that's going to be similar? I'm curious both from a geography standpoint and, of course, industry and function as well.
As far as the desire or the willingness to hire people from outside of the EU, I just want to make sure I understand the question for you.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't see. Well, I think as with a lot of places in the world, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the world of politics and even beyond that, just the psyche of different cultures in general. And I think that as long as we still have the approach of, I don't want to say free market trade, but the willingness of accepting highly skilled talent from other places, I don't necessarily see that changing. I think, I'll say this because I'm from the U.S., I think the U.S. is suffering from a lack of highly skilled talent that either is opting not to go to the United States for their education or for their jobs afterwards, but also just what we're educating in that country in general, who we're educating and how we approach STEM, for example, and those kind of things. In Europe, as the EU continues to deal with different bumps in the road and different things, I think for the foreseeable future, things are still strong. Obviously, there are threats to that, as different governments come into place that have different viewpoints on immigration and how to work with and how to integrate with people coming from other parts of the world, that could be a challenge. In the Netherlands, there is a real history, a long history of working with other cultures, of trade and of commerce. And I don't see that as being, and 60% of our students stay in the Netherlands. So I don't think I'm as worried about that. But I think for the foreseeable future, it's still going to be a strong job market. There are always things on the horizon. We talk about Brexit a lot in this industry. How is that going to affect things? We talk about what's going on in the United States and how that affects things as far as application volumes and things like that. But, to me, those are what I would consider more short-term things. So Brexit's going to be resolved in the next 2 years. And then, of course, there'll be the outcomes of that and the effects. Same thing in the U.S., this over the next couple of years, some of those things will resolve themselves. But I think in general, I still feel optimistic, very optimistic about what's going on in Europe and how there is a desire to hire for good talent, regardless of where they're from. And I think that's one of the key differentiators of Europe in general, especially the Netherlands, but Europe in general, about how they view talent and where that talent comes from.
And when I spoke with you guys 6 years ago, the visa policy was graduates could stay in the Netherlands for 1 year to find that ideal job. Is that still the same?
Yeah, absolutely. So when someone comes in, they come in as a student on an 18-month student visa. And remember, our program is 12 months. So you start in January. The visa runs through until June. So January to December is the program itself. And then the graduation is in March. So a lot of candidates will actually do an internship in between those months of December or early March. But then the visa is through June. And again, 90% within 3 months of graduation on either side have a job. So most people don't even utilize the 1 year. We call it a search visa or an orientation visa. However, it is available, and that's for another 12 months.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's 12 months. Now, something that might not have been mentioned before is that you can start that visa immediately, or you can do it within 3 years of graduation. So you could theoretically go home. You could, travel around the world for 6 months to take a break from being in an MBA program, and then come back and start that visa, so long as it's within 3 years of the graduation of the program. So I think that's another kind of key differentiator of the Netherlands versus other countries in the world, actually. It's having a very friendly policy to visas. Absolutely.
And one last question on your placements. I noticed that, I think maybe it was last year, quite a big chunk of your grads ended up in consumer products.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I think it was around 35 or 40%. Yeah. Is that a consistent stat, or is that kind of an outlier?
Ask me next year.
Okay.
If you ask me this year, I would probably say it's an outlier. In general, the most popular, it is one of the top 4 areas: consulting, finance, IT, and energy, and then consumer packaged goods or fast-moving consumer packaged goods. Those tend to be the most popular ones. So, for example, if you looked at not this current class that graduated, but the year prior, it was a lot of IT jobs. So LinkedIn and Google's and Microsoft's and Amazon's recruited a lot of our students that year. And again, going way back to the beginning of our conversation, talking about the different industries and the variety of industries we have coming into the program, it doesn't or shouldn't come as a surprise that the industries in which they go into are really varied as well. And in a way, you can look at that one of two ways. You could say, oh, well, it's so varied. I don't know if that's a good thing. But for me, it shows that you can be what you want to be after doing an MBA at RSM. You're not bound to being a consultant. You're not bound to being in finance. And there's nothing wrong with that. For those schools that are known for those things, that's great. But for us, we're not. And I think that's something else when we talk about the kind of candidates we attract. I think that is attractive to them that, I'm not from that world. I have no interest in being in those worlds. I want to be able to follow my own path that doesn't involve finance or consulting. And so I'll look at RSM. But then again, for those people that do, we obviously have strong placement there as well. So yeah, I think this year I would call that an outlier. Although again, Unilever, Heineken, we have strong presence with Under Armour, with Adidas. There's a lot of different companies there. So I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing that. But, let's touch base next year with this current class when they get out into the world, and we'll see what happens there.
You got it. So this has been just a really fantastic open conversation. Thank you for, sharing, I guess, frankly, some controversial thoughts about GMAT and some other things. But I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to give you, one last question, which is, is there anything else about the RSM MBA program that you just wish the applicant world knew about?
I think what I would say to that is when you're doing your research for programs, look beyond your first 3 or 4 choices. This is a big decision. And there are a lot of great programs, RSM included and otherwise, that might not come up in your first searches for MBAs. And don't go just off of the rankings. That could be a whole nother podcast in its own right.
Yeah, we should definitely do that one at some point.
And if you want to be controversial, we can definitely do that one. I think the key with anything is to really understand what matters to you. So if studying and working in Europe matters to you, you should come to RSM. If being in a classroom that's one of the 15 most diverse classrooms in the world, you should come to RSM. So when you're looking at things like rankings, or you're looking for those things, identify what matters to you. And then when you speak to the schools, ask them those questions. When you're looking at rankings, go underneath that main number. So we're 37th in the world by the FT. Look underneath and see those different areas that we have and see if the things that matter to you, we do well in. I think that's one of the most crucial things is to really find the program that fits for you. And, if it's a top 10 program in the world, great. But if it's not, be comfortable with expanding your search. I think that's something that's critical, and to ask really good questions and be, diligent in what you do, because that's one of the ways you can ensure that, not only do you do the program a good program for the time you're in the program, but what's that community look like afterwards?
Yes.
That's the lasting part of an MBA. That's what matters 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years down the road. That's what really matters. And so I think that it's hard when you're making that decision today to really project that far into the future. I mean, I know I didn't do that at 25, 26 years old, but I think that those are the things that really matter. So yeah, that's just some thoughts about that.
Thank you, Brandon, so much. Really enjoyed having you on the show.
My pleasure. And thank you for giving me the opportunity and for hopefully having some interesting things, and hopefully everyone's still awake or still listening. And I'd welcome any questions or comments. Darren, you can post the way to get in touch with me for that. But again, thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Don't be shy. We have a mailing list. Go to touchmba.com and get yourself signed up. And we'll keep you posted with the best tips and insider interviews on how to get into your number one school. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Touch MBA. See you soon.